Please enjoy this original recording of the Mini Bible College, also known as MBC, hosted by the author himself, Pastor Dick Woodward, in the 1980s. International Cooperating Ministries is privileged to make his timeless Bible lessons available. Each weekly episode is 30 minutes. Together, these sessions create a 3-year curriculum. This practical walk through the Bible is nurturing believers and equipping disciples speaking 31 languages in more than 50,000 small group Bible studies around the world. Now, here's Pastor Woodward with the Mini Bible College.
He told them this parable. No one tears a patch from a new garment and sews it on an old one. If he does, he will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins. The wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one after drinking old wine wants the new, for he always says, the old is better. There are a great many teachings of Jesus Christ which tell us how to approach His Word. His parable of the sower was a classic example of this. In the parable of the sower, He told us about how we should respond to His Word and how critical it is that we respond to His Word in the right way. Take heed how you hear the Word was the application to that parable. Many of the teachings of Jesus address this issue of how we should approach His Word and respond to it so we'll get the maximum benefit from it. Here's one of my favorite ones. He says, first of all, when you want to patch an old garment, you don't take a patch from a new garment and sew it on an old one. Any seamstress will tell you that if you do that, this new material will pull the old material and you'll make your hole bigger. Now what he's saying there is, his teaching is going to tear apart the religious establishment. The religious establishment had an approach to Scripture. We've seen it before, especially in the Sermon on the Mount and in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus was saying, I am not going to coexist with the religious establishment. What I am teaching you is a new patch, and you can't put it on an old garment. Now, along the same lines, he gives this illustration. And this was a common, ordinary, everyday illustration of these people. You never take new wine or unfermented wine or grape juice and put it in an old brittle wineskin. They kept their wine in goat skins then. Now they all knew what he was talking about. If you took this unfermented wine or new wine and put it in an old brittle wineskin and hung it on the wall, as that wine fermented and expanded, it would put pressure on the inside of that goat skin. And if the goat skin were brittle and inflexible and wouldn't yield to the pressure would build up until there would be an explosion. Maybe they'd be taking a nap or a siesta in the middle of the afternoon and there'd be a loud pop sound and there'd be wine running down the wall. And they knew they made that mistake. He said, no, new wine, unfermented wine must be put into a new wineskin so that when the wine ferments and expands and puts pressure on that goat skin, the goat skin will yield to the pressure and then both will be preserved, the wine and the wineskin. Years ago, several ministers in a small town and I decided to meet with a psychiatrist and the staff of a mental hygiene center. We met once a week for a year and discussed what we had in common and where we differed in our approach to the problems that people have. We as pastors and they as psychiatrists and, psychiatric social workers, psychologists, and that sort of thing. Now, I remember that sometimes the confrontation got pretty sharp between us during that year. And one evening, after meeting for a couple of hours in a rather heated session, we decided to go out for dinner. And I'll never forget, as we sat down to dinner, the psychologist who was on this psychiatrist staff, who seemed to have been angry with me all afternoon, as we were sitting down to the dinner table, he said, "You preachers make people sick." And I said, "Well, tell me about it." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you about it." He said, "These people that come to see us, actually, we started meeting because the psychiatrist wanted to get referrals from the ministers for this clinic she was opening. But after just a few weeks, she had a waiting list 3 months long, and she didn't need referrals from anybody. They were swamped with people. And this psychologist said to me, all these people that are coming to see us, they're not pagans. They go to your churches, and they listen to your sermons. And they sit there and nod their head, But then they go out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and they don't live like that. You tell them this, love your neighbor, love your enemy, and all that other junk, he said. And then they sit there, nod their head like they believe it, and smile. But then they go out all week long and they just skin them alive in the marketplace. They don't really believe that stuff. And he said, all you're really doing is creating a lot of conflict in their minds. You're giving them a lot of conflict that finally one day just builds up until they just blow up. And to respond to that, I said, maybe it was something like this. And I told him this little parable of Jesus about the unfermented wine in the old brittle wineskin. I said, you know what I think Jesus was saying here was this. Before you decide to come to my word and take it into your mind, make up your mind about this. My word is going to put pressure on you. It's the unfermented wine. It's the new wine. And when you take it into your mind, my teaching is going to just build up and put pressure on you. And if you don't yield to the pressure it puts on you, my teaching will blow your mind. I said to him, do you think that's what you're trying to explain? And I showed him that that was in the scripture. And he looked at it and couldn't believe that that was in the Bible. And he said, yeah, it's just like that. He said, that's exactly what it is, you know. And I said, well, Jesus taught that. And he said, well, do you tell the people that when they come to hear the teaching? Well, so now I'm telling you, see. I don't want to make people sick. I don't want to be guilty of what he accused me of, making people sick all day, because I give you the teaching of Jesus, and you take it in and don't ever intend to yield to the pressure it puts on you. Jesus warned us here. He said, if you do that, sooner or later my teaching will blow your mind. That's really what he was saying. One time I saw these words written on a wall. To do is to be, Descartes. To be is to do, Pascal. Doobie-doobie-doo, Sinatra. Now, whoever wrote those words, and this was on the wall of a men's room on the New Jersey Turnpike, it's not a very poetic source, you know. But whoever wrote those words, they were saying this. There was a time when people really said something. But all this generation has to say is doobie-doobie-doo. See, people believe that the old is better. I've asked a lot of Bible scholars and theologians about, building a library, and they always say, the old wine is better. Remember that. People used to think, and they used to really say something, so the old wine is probably better. Get the old church fathers. They're probably a whole lot better than what you'll, get from the modern theologians. Well, another teaching where Jesus told us how to approach his teaching is in the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. He asked this question, to what shall I compare the men of this generation? What are they like? And then he answered his question by saying this, they are like children in the marketplace. In the marketplace in those days, children used to fantasize and play games. They still do that. I used to think there was something wrong with my children because they were always fantasizing, and then I found out they were just like other children. Children are always playing these games and fantasizing. Well, in a busy marketplace, imagine little children that are playing funeral. And they try to stop the busy merchants that are bustling by and say, stop and cry with us because we're playing funeral. They see funeral processions, and so they imitate what they see. Stop and cry with us. We're playing funeral today. And maybe the next day they say, oh, we're playing wedding today. So be happy. Well, the busy merchant isn't going to get involved in children's games. But you see what Jesus was saying in Luke chapter 7, verses 28 to 35 was this. He was speaking for his own teaching and the teaching of John the Baptist. And he said, John the Baptist and I have not come to play your little games. John the Baptist was a very austere religious man. He didn't drink at all. He kept a very strict religious regimen. Now, this is an interesting passage because it says, Jesus said, but I eat food and drink my wine, and you say a glutton. And he drinks, and he has the lowest sort of friends. Now, what he's suggesting is, I came into the world with one stance, enjoying life, is the way some translations put it, the happy man. John the Baptist came very austere. You say John the Baptist has a demon, and you call me a drunkard and a glutton. But you see, you're just little children in the marketplace. And John the Baptist and I are not going to play your little games. You're telling John the Baptist to be happy and play wedding. Well, he didn't come to play your little games. He came to do what God ordered him to do. And you want me to play funeral. I'm presenting the happy man. And you want me to be sad and austere. Well, I didn't come to play your little games. You see what a hard saying that is? Someone has written a book entitled The Hard Sayings of Jesus. Many of the sayings of Jesus are hard sayings. And in the Gospel of Luke as well as the Gospel of Matthew, you see this hostile dialogue between Jesus and the religious establishment, and he said some very hard things to them, just like the parable of the children in the marketplace. Now in Luke chapter 7, you have another great parable of Jesus. It comes out of a lunch appointment that he kept with a Pharisee. A Pharisee invited him to lunch. His name was Simon. And obviously the motives of this Pharisee for inviting Jesus to lunch were to entrap him. This is why the religious establishment had most of their dialogue with Jesus. Now, while they were having lunch, a woman of the street, a prostitute, who heard that Jesus was there, brought an exquisite flask filled with expensive perfume. Going in, she knelt behind him at his feet, weeping, with her tears falling down upon his feet, and she wiped them off with her hair and kissed them and poured the perfume on them. When Jesus' host, the Pharisee, saw what was happening and realized who this woman was, he said to himself, "This proves that Jesus is no prophet, for if God had really sent him, he would know the kind of woman this is." Now, Jesus always knew what they were thinking, and so he knows that Simon's thinking this, and he says, "Simon, I have a little story I'd like to tell you. A certain man had two people indebted to him. One owed him $5,000 and one owed him $500. And he canceled both debts. And when he did that, which of these two do you suppose would love him the most?" And the Pharisee said, "I suppose the one that owed the greater debt." And Jesus said, "You're exactly right." And then he asked this question, and you don't get this in the English as much as you do in the Greek original language. He said, "Simon, do you see this woman?" And he uses a Greek word that says, "Do you really see her? What do you see when you look at this woman?" Now let me tell you what's really going on here, Simon. He said, "When I came to your home today, you didn't wash my feet," which was like shaking hands. "You didn't offer me oil to anoint my head," which was another custom of hospitality. But he said, "This woman has washed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. You didn't give me any oil for my head," which was common hospitality. "She's given me this expensive perfume. She's put it on my feet." Now the application to what he says about this woman, the way he links her to his little parable is this. "Her sins, which are many," he said, "are forgiven because she loved much." And the application, of course, is this. The people who are forgiven little in their own eyes love little, and the people who are forgiven much in their own perspective love a great deal. Now he turns to the woman before she leaves and he says, "Your faith has saved you." She wasn't saved because she loved much. She loved much because she was saved. Apparently she'd already met Christ and her life had been turned around. She'd been born again. Imagine what that would mean to a woman like that. That's why she's just carried away in worshiping him and showing love for him. But what he's really saying at that luncheon is, "Simon, the real sinner at this table is not this woman. The real sinner at this table is a Pharisee named Simon." If you ask the question, "Will the real sinner please stand up?" When the real sinner stands up at that lunch that day, it was not that woman whose sins were obvious and known to everybody. It was the Pharisee named Simon. And of course, this by application is saying to us, we don't want to give the impression, especially young people, that it's better to sin a great deal and then be forgiven a great deal and then love a great deal. There really isn't anything good about sin. And it isn't good to sin a great deal and then be saved from a great deal of sin. But it is a fact, and it reminds you of the Confessions of St. Augustine, that when somebody does sin a great deal and they are truly converted and they're reached in this life of sin, when they are truly repentant and contrite, they do love sometimes a whole lot more than the person who thinks they haven't been forgiven anything. As Simon saw himself, when his sin was forgiven, it was just a small thing. He didn't see himself as a great sinner. The woman did see herself as a great sinner. Of course, the other application here is obvious too. The way you perceive yourself has a lot to do with the way you perceive others. He told us that in the Sermon on the Mount, and he tells us that in this little parable as well. Now, as you continue to move through the Gospel of Luke, looking for some of these passages that are not covered in Matthew, there's a little incident in chapter 8 where you see the patient priorities of Jesus. With so much demand upon him, have you ever wondered how he sorted out the priorities? Who did he take first? Who did he take second? He must have refused to work with a lot of people. Well, there's an incident in Luke chapter 8 that shows his absolute impartiality, but also something about his priorities. There is a man who is a leader of the synagogue. He's somebody. He's really important. His name is Jairus. And he's got a little daughter, 12 years old, who's gravely ill. And he comes to Jesus to get Jesus to intercede for his little girl. Now, while he's involved in this, there's a crowd of people there, and there's a woman who's just a nobody, and she has a disease that causes her to just bleed continuously. Now, in the book of Leviticus, it said that a woman like that was forbidden to touch anybody. She was practically quarantined. But she believes her only hope is to get to Jesus. And so while he's busy working with this very important man and the problem that he has, the woman just reaches out and touches him. And when she touches him, Jesus interrupts his dealing with the important man, and he says, "Who touched me?" And the apostles say, "Well, the whole crowd's jostling you. What do you mean, who touched you?" But he means something deeper than this. He says, "No, somebody deliberately touched me. I felt healing power go out of me. Who touched me?" Now, does he not know who touched him? Of course he knows. He wants this woman to have the faith to confess that she deliberately touched him because she believed it would heal her if she did. And she finally does confess. She comes forward and confesses, "I touched you." And after he deals with her, and again he tells her that her faith has healed her, then he turns back to this man. Just as he does, the messengers come and tell the ruler of the synagogue, "Your daughter's dead. Don't trouble the teacher anymore." But Jesus turns to him and he says, "Don't be afraid, just trust me." And then they go on to the home of this man, and the daughter is raised from the dead. This is one of his greatest miracles, of course. I think this is a very touching story because it shows us the impartiality of Jesus and his priorities. Why did he put the woman first and let the man's daughter die? If you think about it for a minute, who had the greater need? This man had had 12 years of sunshine because he had a little girl for 12 years. What did this woman have? Just 12 years of darkness and sickness. I think as Jesus saw this particular situation, her need was the greater need. So that's a very beautiful story, and the Gospel of Luke is just filled with stories like that. Now, when you come to the end of Luke chapter 10, you come to one of my very favorite little passages. The last verses of Luke chapter 10 introduce us to two women that Jesus loved very much. They were sisters, and their names were Mary and Martha. We'll meet them again in the Gospel of John. And Luke is giving us now the human touch all the way through the Gospel of Luke. And it's Luke who tells us about this conflict between these two sisters. Jesus visits their home in Bethany. He visits it often later on, because when he goes into the synagogues and when he goes into the temple in Jerusalem and has a lot of that hostile dialogue with the religious establishment, it probably wearies him a great deal. And it's his practice to come back to the home of Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus, which is in a suburb of Jerusalem in Bethany, and that's where he rests. He refreshes himself there. But this is probably one of his very first meetings with them. He's coming to their home. And these two sisters are very different. The way Martha looks at it, you know, Emmanuel, God with us, he's coming to have lunch in my home. And so she decides the important thing is everything's got to be just proper and right. The silverware has to go in 14 directions, and you know, the napkins folded precise. Everything's got to be just perfect. And she's very much concerned about those things. Now, her sister Mary is very different. Mary looks at it this way: the living Word of God has become flesh and is living among us, and he's coming to my home. The important thing is to sit at his feet and hear his word. So you have Mary in the living room, sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to his word, enjoying the Bible study, and Martha out in the kitchen, bustling about the serving. Now, Martha is not shy. Martha comes bursting in on the Bible study, and just blap, she just says, "Don't you care that she's left me to do all this work?" And what she's implying is, tell her to get out here and help me with this service. And I've always admired the Lord as being so decisive here. He doesn't try to just walk away from this and let them work it out or something. He sides with Mary. He looks at Martha. Now, he loves Martha, probably as much as he loves Mary. But he looks at Martha and he says, "Martha, Martha, you're bothered and troubled about so many things. Only one thing is really important. That's the thing that Mary has chosen, and I will not take it away from her." He sides with Mary against Martha. Now, these two women have become symbols of something that's very important in the life of the church today by application. In the church today, we have these two kinds of people. We have the Marys and the Marthas. Somebody summed up the Marys this way: some people are so heavenly minded they're no earthly good. And then sometimes the Mary will look at the Martha and say, some people are so earthly minded they're no heavenly good. And so you've got these two kinds of people. Now, my experience has been that when the church was growing there in the book of Acts, it reached a point where the Marys and the Marthas needed each other. Remember in Acts chapter 6, they had a lot of administration develop as the church grew. And so they made this very important decision. They chose some, what we would call today, deacons. And the people who were the Marys, the pastoral people, they said to these Marthas, "You see to this business, and we will give ourselves continuously to prayer and the ministry of the word." In other words, the Marys said, "We're going to be Mary, and you be Martha. You stand in your place, and we'll stand in our place." Now, today we still have these two kinds of people. You have people who are Marys in the sense that they're primarily pastoral, and very often the Mary type person gets a vision from God, they get a word from God, and because they implement that vision and preach that word, things really happen, and before long you need Marthas because you've got a need for organization and administration. So then the Marthas appear on the scene, and they organize, and they deputize, and all of that, they administrate. And then, of course, the Marthas, I think, need to appreciate the fact that if it were not for the Marys, there wouldn't be anything to organize or administrate. There wouldn't be any need for them if it were not for the Marys. I think it's unfortunate that very often these two separate kinds of people find it very difficult to respect each other. But they ought to respect each other and thank God for each other. Sometimes Mary doesn't have ulcers because she's a carrier. She gives them to Martha. Sometimes Mary has the peace because Martha's got the pieces. It's this kind of thing. You hear this all the time. I think in summary, we asked the question in your notes, should Mary help Martha with the dishes? I think Jesus said no. No, she doesn't belong out there in the kitchen. She's not supposed to give up this pastoral thing, this spiritual devotional thing that God has given her. And should Martha get out of the kitchen and come in and join the Bible study? Again, I think the answer is no, because according to Jesus, both of these are necessary. Both of these types of people are necessary. Now, there's a parable in Luke chapter 18 and also one in Luke chapter 11, which really emphasizes what we call today importunate prayer. And I think it's very important that we understand this teaching in the Scripture because it's an emphasis with Jesus. In Luke chapter 11, he gives this teaching because they come to him after he has just spent a great deal of time in prayer, and they say, "Lord, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples." Now, they're not so much asking him for the mechanics of prayer. They're saying to him, "Tell us whatever it is you know that motivates you to spend so much time in prayer. Why do you pray so much? Whatever it is that you know that we don't know, teach us that." That's really what they're saying. And so as he gives this teaching on prayer, he says, "Which of you has a friend and will go to him at midnight and say to him, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves, for a friend of mine has arrived on a journey and I have nothing to set before him.' And he will answer from within, 'Do not bother me. The door is now shut and my children are in bed with me. I cannot get up and give you anything.' I tell you, though he will not get up because he is his friend, yet because of his importunity, he will give him whatever he needs. I understand in those days they went to bed with a kind of a bedroll where they sort of wound the children into the bedroll, and once they got all wound up there together, it was really distressing to have a knock at the door. And you have to unravel the whole business. And so the people would say, no, I can't do that. I'm all wrapped up in bed with my children. Well, Jesus is saying now, he may not get up and unravel all of that business because you're his friend. But if you just keep knocking, it's like when a baby cries. You just eventually get up. That's importunity. And what that's teaching, and you find this taught much in the teaching of Jesus, is that we should keep on asking, we should keep on seeking, we should keep on knocking. In other words, we should persevere in prayer. This is the idea. Now, there's a little parable also in Luke 17 where he says, when you have persevered as a servant of Jesus Christ, all you should do is say, we are unworthy slaves, we have only done that which it was our duty to do. In this little parable in chapter 17, verses 7 to 10, Jesus is saying that when you persevere and you have this stickability, this fortitude, and you do serve God maybe for 50 years, you shouldn't act as if that's something abnormal. That's really very normative. All you should do is say, I'm just an unworthy servant. I have only done that which it was my duty to do. Jesus asked the question in Luke 6:46, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say? It should be the normal Christian life for us to serve the Lord and to persevere in serving him. We should always serve him at his feet, hearing his word and accepting his will and worshiping him.
For more information on the Mini Bible College, please visit www.minibiblecollege.org or call 1-800-999-3892. International Cooperating Ministries is located at 1901 North Armistead Avenue in Hampton, Virginia.